April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. Valery Legasov stands in Reactor 4's control room, staring at radiation readings that defy physics. The phone rings. Moscow. Say nothing about design flaws. His hand trembles. In his Moscow apartment, locked in a desk drawer, sits a sealed envelope. Yellow edges, red stamp, classified, rejected. Inside 47 pages of calculations he wrote 3 years ago, numbers that predicted this exact failure. He submitted them to the State Committee in 1983. They ignored him. He kept the only copy. Now 50,000 people sleep 3 kilometers away in Pripyat. The city hasn't been evacuated. He has 4 hours to decide, follow orders or tell the truth. The envelope predicted everything: the positive void coefficient, the runaway reaction, the graphite fire now burning into the sky. What he does next will either save thousands or destroy him. He can't do both. By the mid-1970s, Valery Legasov was already a legend in Soviet science. The youngest member of the Academy of Sciences, a chemical physicist with a mind that saw patterns others missed. He wasn't a nuclear engineer. That was the point. In 1983, the State Committee assigned him to review RBMK reactor safety protocols. Fresh eyes, they said, no institutional loyalty to the designers. He studied the blueprints for months in his Moscow office, red pen in hand, marking calculations that didn't add up. The RBMK design had a fatal flaw: a positive void coefficient. When cooling water turned to steam, the reaction didn't slow down. It accelerated. Legasov ran the numbers 17 times. Same result. If coolant failed, the reactor would race toward meltdown in seconds, not minutes. He wrote it all down. 47 pages of mathematical proof. Diagrams showing exactly how the core would destabilize. He sealed the envelope on a cold November night, his fountain pen still wet on the date. November 12th, 1983. On his desk sat a stack of blueprints covered in his red annotations, arrows pointing to the cooling channels, notes in the margins. Unstable under loss of coolant. He submitted the report the next morning. Then he waited. Being right means nothing if nobody wants to listen. January 1984. Moscow. The State Committee met in a sterile conference room, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Legasov's report sat on the table, still sealed. Anatoly Alexandrov, the chief designer of the RBMK reactor, was 83 years old, hero of socialist labor, the man who built the Soviet nuclear program from nothing. He dismissed Legasov's findings without opening the envelope. Theoretical concerns, Alexandrov said, waving his hand. The RBMK has operated safely for years. 17 reactors across the Soviet Union ran on Alexandrov's design. To admit a flaw meant shutting down the entire grid. Legasov sat silent, watching his work ignored. After the meeting, he retrieved the envelope from the pile of forgotten documents. He took it home, locked it in his desk drawer beneath other files. He went back to his chemical research, buried his frustration in late-night calculations. His wife noticed the change. He stopped sleeping well, woke at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. The envelope stayed in the drawer, edges yellowing. The stamp faded from red to rust. 2 years passed. The reactors kept running. Legasov kept working. And then, at 4:17 a.m. on April 26, 1986, his phone rang. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing is being ignored. Deputy Chairman Boris Sherbina's voice crackled through the receiver. There's been an incident at Chernobyl. You're needed immediately. By dawn, Legasov was in a helicopter flying south. Through the window, he saw it. Reactor 4. The core exposed, graphite burning white hot against the morning sky. He knew immediately what had happened. The positive void coefficient. Coolant turned to steam. Runaway reaction. Exactly what he'd calculated in 1983. Before leaving his apartment, he'd opened his desk drawer and grabbed the envelope, slipping it into his briefcase. Now it sat beside him on the helicopter seat, vibrating with the rotor noise. The explosion had released radiation equivalent to 400 times the Hiroshima bomb, a number that wouldn't be confirmed for weeks. But Legasov could already estimate it from the glow. When they landed, officials were arguing about evacuation timing. Moscow wanted silence, no panic, no admission of design failure. Legasov stood on the edge of the contaminated zone, briefcase in hand. Watching smoke rise from the reactor, he had proof in his hands, proof that this disaster was predictable, preventable, written down 3 years ago. But he was surrounded by people who needed him to be wrong. Proof means nothing when you're surrounded by people who need you to be wrong. May 1986. The evacuation zone around Pripyat was a ghost city, abandoned apartments, empty streets, Geiger counters clicking in the silence. Legasov met Ulana Komyuk in a contaminated apartment building. She was a composite of several physicists, but in the legend, she became one person. The scientist compiling testimonies from operators, engineers, anyone who survived. They all say the same thing, she told Legasov, flipping through her notes. The instruments malfunctioned. The control rods made it worse. Legasov opened his briefcase. The envelope was there, edges more yellow than ever. He handed it to her. She read it standing by the window, her gloved hands holding the pages carefully, the Geiger counter on the table clicking steadily. "You wrote this in 1983? She asked. He nodded. They rejected it. Outside, across the street, a KGB officer stood with a camera, photographing them through the window. Komyuk saw him and closed the envelope. "If we're going to tell this story, we need to be ready," she said. "Vienna conference is in 6 months. We'll either speak or stay silent forever. Over 350,000 people would eventually be evacuated from the exclusion zone, a fact that would become public only later, but Legasov already knew the scale. The truth is evidence. Evidence makes you dangerous." June 1986. Legasov was summoned to meet Alexandrov in a Moscow office that smelled of old wood and cigarette smoke. The designer sat behind a heavy desk, framed awards on the wall behind him. "The operators caused this," Alexandrov said slowly. "That's the story." Legasov opened his briefcase. The envelope was visible inside, yellow against the dark leather. Alexandrov's eyes locked on it. "That report," he said quietly. "Burn it. It never existed." Legasov's hand hovered over the envelope. Then he closed the briefcase without removing it. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room. Alexandrov leaned back. "Do you understand what admitting a design flaw would mean? 17 reactors. The entire Soviet electrical grid. We can't shut it all down." Legasov understood. They weren't protecting a lie. They were protecting a system that couldn't afford to be wrong. He left the meeting with the envelope still in his briefcase, resealed. But now he knew the stakes. National stability versus scientific truth. And he had 6 months to decide which mattered more. Outside Moscow, traffic roared. Legasov walked through the noise, briefcase in hand, the envelope inside heavier than ever. They weren't protecting a lie, they were protecting a system. July through October 1986. Legasov and Komyuk worked in secret, interviewing liquidators, operators, engineers, anyone who'd been in the control room or near the reactor that night. Every testimony pointed to the same critical moment. The AZ-5 emergency shutdown button. When Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov ordered it pressed, The control rods descended into the core. For 7 seconds, the reaction accelerated instead of stopping. The graphite tips on the rods displaced cooling water, creating a brief power surge. That surge caused the explosion. Legasov's 1983 calculations had predicted this exact failure mode. Komyuk wrote it all down in a notebook. Operator quotes, timestamps, radiation readings. In the margins, she copied sections of Legasov's math. The evidence was overwhelming. But ministry officials were already confiscating interview recordings, sealing documents, rewriting reports. The official version was forming. Operator error, protocol violations, human mistakes. No mention of design flaws. Over 600,000 liquidators would eventually be deployed to contain the disaster. Men who worked in lethal radiation zones, shoveling graphite off roofs, burying contaminated soil. Legasov watched the cover-up build like a slow avalanche. A cover-up isn't a conspiracy, it's momentum. And the Vienna conference was 4 weeks away. November 1986, Moscow. A windowless room in the ministry building. Party officials surrounded Legasov as he drafted the official report. Blame operator error exclusively, they told him. Protocol violations, human judgment failures. Legasov wrote 2 versions. The public version blamed operators Anatoly Akimov and Alexander Toptunov, both dead from radiation exposure, unable to defend themselves. The private version detailed the positive void coefficient, the control rod design flaw, the systemic failure Legasov had warned about in 1983. He made photocopies of the envelope and distributed them in unmarked folders to scientists he trusted. Insurance, he told himself. If anything happened to him, the truth would survive. Sherbina pulled him aside after one meeting. "Say what you must in Vienna," he said quietly. "Just not here." It was permission and a warning. Speak abroad, but not at home. Legasov understood. The Soviet Union could handle international criticism. It couldn't handle domestic doubt. He sealed the photocopies, kept the original envelope in his briefcase. In 3 months, he'd stand in front of 800 scientists in Vienna. 1 microphone, 1 chance. Permission to tell the truth isn't the same as protection. August 1988, Vienna. The International Atomic Energy Agency conference hall was packed. 800 scientists from 62 countries, stage lights, cameras. Legasov stood at the podium, notes in front of him. He was supposed to present the official version, operator error, procedural failures, human mistakes. For 18 minutes, he did exactly that. The Soviet delegation in the 3rd row nodded approvingly. Then Legasov paused. He looked down at his notes, handwritten amendments he'd added that morning, not approved by Moscow. "But there is another factor we must address," he said. The room went silent. He described the positive void coefficient, the control rod design, the fundamental instability in the RBMK reactor that made it vulnerable to runaway reactions. Not operator error, design flaw. The Soviet delegation froze. Cameras clicked. Legasov didn't mention the 1983 envelope. He saved that proof for later. But he laid out the technical reality in terms every nuclear scientist in the room understood. His Vienna testimony would go on to change international reactor safety standards, force modifications to RBMK designs worldwide. But in that moment, speaking truth to 800 witnesses, Legasov knew what it would cost him. Courage isn't fearlessness, it's knowing the cost and speaking anyway. September 1988. The response came within 72 hours. Legasov was stripped of his committee positions, removed from advisory boards, isolated from the scientific community he'd spent his life building. His phone was tapped. He could hear the clicks on the line. His mail was opened, resealed with obvious carelessness. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues avoided him in hallways. The international community honored him, awards, citations, invitations to speak. The Soviet press ignored it all. He was being erased domestically while being celebrated abroad. A ghost in his own country. Diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome from his time at Chernobyl, Legasov knew his time was limited. He moved the envelope from his briefcase to a safety deposit box along with his will. Then he started recording audio memoirs, 5 cassette tapes, the full story. The 1983 warning, the rejection, the cover-up, the Vienna confession. He spoke into the microphone in his apartment, the red recording light glowing in the darkness. Everything they didn't want him to say, preserved on magnetic tape. He gave the tapes to a trusted colleague. "Release them if something happens to me," he said. "They can take your career, they can't take what you know." April 25th, 1988. 2 years to the day before, the 3rd anniversary of Chernobyl. Legasov sat alone in his Moscow apartment, recording his final cassette tape. The cassette player's red light blinked in the quiet room. He mentioned the envelope by date, November 12th, 1983. He described its contents, 47 pages, mathematical proofs, diagrams of reactor instability. He named everyone who'd ignored it. Alexandrov, the State Committee, the officials who chose silence over safety. Beside the cassette player sat the envelope removed from the safety deposit box one last time. He'd kept it sealed all these years, but now he opened it, reading his own calculations from 5 years ago. Every prediction had come true. The next morning, his colleague picked up the tapes as planned. "Don't release them yet," Legasov told him. "Wait until the system can handle it." On April 27th, 1988, exactly 2 years after the disaster, Valery Legasov died in his apartment. The official ruling was suicide. The tapes stayed hidden. The envelope disappeared. It would take 3 more years, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, before the truth could breathe. Some truths wait for the system to fall before they can breathe. The Soviet Union dissolved. KGB archives opened. Investigators began searching for Legasov's 1983 submission, the report he claimed to have filed with the State Committee. The official records showed no receipt, no entry log, no documentation of his warning. It was as if the report had never existed. His personal files were examined. The desk drawer where he'd kept the envelope, empty. A faint dust outline showed where something had sat for years, but the envelope itself was gone. His wife was interviewed. "He kept it in his desk drawer," she said. "It was there until 1986. After Chernobyl, I don't know what happened to it." The original seemed lost to history. Then a photocopy surfaced in Ukraine, one of the unmarked folders Legasov had distributed before Vienna. A scientist he'd trusted had kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. The copy showed everything: the calculations, the warnings, the predictions. But a copy is not the same as the original. The original had the State Committee's rejection stamp. The original was evidence. The copy was a ghost. Proof that the warning existed, but not proof that it had been officially ignored. One person knows where the envelope went. The International Atomic Energy Agency published its comprehensive Chernobyl study, a decade of research, thousands of interviews, complete technical analysis. Legasov's design flaw analysis was confirmed. The positive void coefficient was identified as the central cause of the disaster. RBMK reactors worldwide were retrofitted with safety modifications, redesigned control rods, improved cooling systems, emergency shutdown protocols that actually worked. Several reactors were shut down permanently. Legasov's Vienna testimony became the foundation of new international nuclear safety standards. His warnings ignored in 1983, dismissed in 1984, became accepted scientific fact by 1996. In 2006, the Russian government quietly awarded him posthumous recognition, a ceremony with minimal press coverage, an acknowledgement that came 18 years too late. The awards meant nothing to Legasov. He'd been dead for 18 years. But they meant something to the engineers who'd listened to him, the scientists who'd believed him, the liquidators who'd wished someone had stopped the disaster before it started. His vindication was complete, except for one thing. The envelope, the original with its rejection stamp and dated seal, was still missing. Redemption doesn't undo what silence cost. 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. A memorial museum opened in Kiev, dedicated to the victims, the liquidators, the scientists who tried to contain it. Legasov's daughter attended the opening ceremony. She brought items to donate to the collection. His notebooks, his photographs, his scientific awards. Among them, a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, dated November 12th, 1983. She'd found it during a renovation of his Moscow apartment. Behind a wall panel in a hidden cavity he'd created sat the original. He'd sealed it there before Vienna. The desk drawer copy had been a decoy, something for the KGB to find and confiscate if they searched his home. The real envelope had waited 33 years in the wall. Now it sits in a museum display case, preserved under glass. Visitors can read the first page through the protective covering. Critical instability analysis, RBMK reactor positive void coefficient under loss of coolant scenarios. The calculations that predicted everything. The warning nobody wanted to hear. Chernobyl's reactor core is still monitored today, 20,000 years, until the radiation decays to safe levels. The envelope that could have prevented it rests 300 kilometers away, behind glass, finally visible. He hid the proof where they'd never look, in plain sight, buried in time. The envelope that nobody wanted to open in 1983 now sits in a museum protected by glass, the same barrier that once protected those who ignored it. What he wrote in silence became what the world learned in fire. Sometimes being early isn't the same as being heard. Sometimes it takes 30 years and 31 deaths for a sealed warning to finally matter.